The paintings by Carlo Basilico at the Polus in Balerna. Tucked away in a former factory in Balerna, Ticino, is a cycle of paintings that captures the spirit of Mendrisiotto during a time of upheaval.
These paintings trace the evolving identity of Mendrisiotto and Ticino during the 1930s and 1940s. A video conversation inspired from an essay by Claudio Guarda.
The Polus in Balerna, once the Alps' most important tobacco plant, houses a remarkable series of paintings from 1942 to 1945, created amid World War II. Commissioned by director Giovanni Staub, a committed patriot and forward-thinking innovator, the refectory's art was meant to inspire. These works are like a visual storybook, documenting Mendrisiotto's identity during upheaval. Today they ask, how do they reflect the clash between rural tradition and industrial modernity?
We are very curious about the history of these works. What can you tell us about them?
This cycle of paintings was commissioned at a very special time. The Polus factory, founded in 1912, had become an important industrial company in Mendrisiotto, employing hundreds of people, mainly women. The director Giovanni Staub created this canteen for them, which also served as a break room. However, he not only wanted to create a functional environment, but also to represent the identity of the company and the region. The commission was awarded to Carlo Basilico, a painter and ornamental artist from Chiasso, who was known for his numerous decorations in private and public buildings in Mendrisiotto, including the graffiti created in 1943 in the former Hotel Bella Vista on Monte Generoso, which can now be seen at the entrance of the Fiori di Pietra Visitor Center.
Could you describe how these works are structured?
Yes, of course. Imagine standing in the Sala Basilico and looking at these paintings that tell stories of labor, tradition, and transformation. The cycle comprises of 3 parts. The first part consists of 12 murals that are like windows to the present and the past. In other words, windows on the creeping development that was underway. They were painted to look like frescoes, but executed as secco paintings, that is, painting on dry plaster, all in a shade of red reminiscent of terra di Siena, an earthy red color traditionally used for sketches in fresco painting and deliberately chosen here as the main color. These paintings hang between the windows of the hall. They show views and scenes of the Mendrisiotto, selected with very specific intentions. The second part comprises 3 main paintings on the short walls of the hall, focusing on work, transformation, and identity. And form the narrative focus of the entire cycle. The following topics are presented: the processing of the tobacco plant, the manufacture of cigars, and the National Day on 1st August. The third part is a series of 9 hinged panels about the cycle of the tobacco plant. These paintings bridge the gap between rural tradition and industrial innovation, and can be arranged as required depending on the use of the space.
Now let's take a closer look at these 12 murals. That sounds like an entire picture story. What kind of scenes did Basilico choose, and what did he want to tell us?
With pleasure. Let's start from the entrance on the left. We look at the scenes and try to understand what they say. This first painting shows the collegiate church of Balerna, where a bride and groom are gathered in the wedding procession on the forecourt.
This scene symbolizes not only the traditional celebrations, but also the connection between religion and community in the region.
A traditional farmhouse in Coldrario,
where a farmer quietly prepares a wicker basket in the courtyard.
View of the rural landscape, Adorna countryside. Very peaceful, but right there, cutting through it, is the railway with a steam train passing by.
And in the neighboring street, the lonely old woman with the rake, tired from her work, points to the loss of the rural way of life.
Followed by the center of Salarino with the parish gate in the middle and Don Spinelli holding onto a stick.
A reference to the individual personality element and the unique spirit of these places.
The Segeno cross with the Church of Santa Maria Assunta in Stabio.
And there's a farmer with 2 oxen on the road who can't get any further.
The Church of St. Anthony in Urbino,
known for its historical and artistic charm. I noticed that these are all rather remote places, not large centers, small villages, churches in the hills, and always people at work or out and about. Was that the intention?
Absolutely. That was a conscious decision by Basilico. Now we look further along the other wall. The Church of Sant'Antonio in Balerna, which is considered a sanctuary.
With a mother or grandmother holding a child's hand, a place of comfort where the bond between the generations is strengthened.
View of the Mugio Valley with Bruzzella.
And 2 men on the bridge, one with a bundle, the other with a basket, and in the foreground a fisherman on a rock, symbols of hard labor and a traditional way of life.
The Hermitage of San Nicolao on the rock above Mendrisio.
A corner where time has stood still, where an elderly woman hoes the vegetable patches in peace and serenity.
The Castel San Pietro Bridge with the roar of motor vehicles.
While a fisherman casts his line at the bottom of the valley to the pleasant sound of the waterfalls.
The Church of St. Giorgio in Morbio Inferiore.
A place of faith, but also a cultural and artistic jewel for its frescoes.
Finally, Casa Navoni in Meride.
With the image of a man carrying 2 water buckets hanging from a wooden dumbbell, recalling a tradition from the past. We are slowly beginning to understand why Basilico chose peripheral areas for these scenes.
It is a necessary decision. Basilico deliberately chooses the periphery to emphasize the contrast between tradition and modernity. Here, where the old and the new collide, ongoing transformation is most clearly visible. Two worlds meet. The 1940s marked a turning point for Ticino. While the war shook Europe, the region continued to industrialize, a process that Basilico neither wanted to idealize nor fight against, but instead helped to reflect. Basilico observes these signs of change with empathy, documenting them without judgment, often linking and comparing these two worlds. The ox carts and the train with all its carriages, the old stone bridges with the new smooth concrete viaducts over which cars and lorries drive. At the same time, however, he also outlines the customs and traditions of a millennia-old rural civilization, the Italian language and culture, which is unique in the Swiss Confederation and today revolves around the Polus.
In short, Basilico documents these places and scenes not out of nostalgia for the past, but because he respects the economic, cultural, and religious history that is part of Mendrisiotto's singular character and is constantly evolving. And what can we say about the technical details of the realization?
In the first phase, Basilico worked on preparatory sketches based on the photographs of his friend, the photographer Gino Pedroli, but with a significant adaptation in the frame of reference and the scenes described. Basilico deliberately chose sanguine tones, soft, earthy reds that evoke melancholy and timelessness. The composition is built up on several levels.
The subdued light reinforces these horizons of memory, a visual reference to the ambivalence between progress and the past. Now, let's turn to the larger paintings that anchor the cycle's narrative.
In fact, these paintings on the short walls of the room form the narrative centerpiece of the cycle. The theme of the first one is women and work in the new era, and shows the processing of the tobacco plant. It is set in a typical Ticino courtyard with a veranda. Basilico uses a rich color palette here, in which the browns, blues, and reds of the figures in the foreground are contrasted by the soft, light colors of the background, on which the figure of the father can be seen explaining to the girl how the work is done.
Could you explain how the narrative unfolds in this painting?
Light and color guide the narrative left to right, showing 3 generations at work: elders binding leaves, adults sorting them, and a child observing. A chain of tradition. But the focal point is the young woman in white, poised between farm and factory, embodying women's newfound independence.
We would like to know more. What is the message to be understood?
The woman in white seems to hover between hope and change. Basilico hides symbolic details. She is aware that this new freedom was won in the shadow of the World War. Her transition from farm to factory symbolizes the emancipation of women, while the other figures remain in the rural world. Basilico emphasizes here the revolutionary character of industrial work for women.
Furthermore, please explain to us how the depiction differs in the second painting.
This painting, entitled "The Production of Cigars," takes us inside the Polus factory. It is the world of industry that is changing the economic and social fortunes of the country. The ambience is completely different. In contrast to the warm, earthy atmosphere of the courtyard, the factory is characterized by cool functionality. The cigar women in white coats stand not only for industrialization, but also for the newfound economic independence of women in a time characterized by the absence of men due to mobilization. The composition is more dynamic, with diagonal lines that draw the eye to the female foreman, explaining the various work steps to a young woman.
Here I have another question. What does the reference to the harbor actually mean?
The view of the port of Genoa in the background symbolizes the economic openness of Ticino and the international reach of the tobacco trade, That is the trade relations of the Polus factory, even in times of war and despite the global conflicts of the time. Some of the tobacco also came by sea from Brazil or other South American countries. The sailing ship and the large ship in the background symbolize Ticino's economic openness to the world.
And now for the third big picture, the National Day on 1st August. This painting reflects Ticino's wartime balancing act, neutrality alongside cultural ties to Italy. How should it be interpreted?
This is a symbolic portrait. Firstly, a comment on the situation at the time. In the 1940s, characterized by a wartime economy and political isolation, Ticino sought a balance between Swiss neutrality and cultural proximity to Italy, an area of tension that Basilico captures. This painting is symbolically the most complex picture. The scene unfolds in layers. A torch-lit procession at night creates a mood of unity and communal pride. The Swiss flag, placed in the center of the picture, stands not only for patriotism, but also for the unity and diversity that Ticino embodies in Switzerland. Basilico emphasizes the passing on of values to the next generation. The children who take part in the celebration not only learn traditions, but also the importance of freedom, democracy, and cohesion, values that were particularly precious in times of dictatorship. Basilico embeds symbolic details that reinforce the significance of his paintings.
That's what interests us. Let's start with the most apparent statements. And what would they be?
Here are some of them. The old man sitting by the roadside, a silent memorial to the marginalized. The couple with the child and the father in uniform are reminders of the mobilization that was still underway. Children with cantonal coats of arms, symbolizing the will to combine local and national spirit. In short, each character tells their own story, but Basilico conceals even more details, small clues for the attentive observer that reveal further layers of meaning.
Could you explain these other aspects in more detail?
Gladly. A second theme runs like a red thread through all three works, namely the importance of educating future citizens. But while the previous two artworks focused on learning, ways of living and working that are fundamental to the social and economic growth of the community, this one is about the complementary, but equally necessary passing on of spiritual and moral values to the next generation. The children who take part in the celebration not only learn traditions, but also the importance of freedom, democracy, and cohesion, values that were particularly precious in times of dictatorship.
Let us now look at the 9 panels, which chronologically represent the most important phases of tobacco processing.
In these artworks, the entire cycle of tobacco processing is depicted in quick succession, from sowing in the farmyard beds to delivery to the factory for the satisfaction of profit. They are characterized by the same delicate, fresh luminosity with pastel tones as the painting, The Processing of the Tobacco Plant, but are more concise and less descriptive. And these are the first 3 steps: sowing the seeds in the beds to obtain the seedlings, plowing the field, and planting the seedlings.
Then follow hoeing with tamping of the clods, grazing with removal of the blossom, and harvesting of the leaves.
The last 3 panels depict the drying of the leaf strands, the packaging in wooden crates, and the proceeds from the sale. The last picture shows the reward for the labor, the sale of the tobacco. It symbolizes the transition from traditional self-sufficient agriculture to a modern, globally networked economy.
This raises the question, what is Basilico's standing in relation to the other artists of his time?
His work is part of a tradition of Ticino mural painting that is often nostalgic or idealized. Instead, Basilico shows a world in motion, staging a country that is slowly developing and thus taking a stand by introducing elements of social criticism. It sheds light on aspects of a changing cantonal identity, the influence of Italian social realism, filtered through a Swiss sensibility, can be recognized in the depiction of the living conditions and everyday life of working people.
Could you perhaps explain what role light plays in these works?
Light is indeed a key element. In the monochrome murals, it is always soft, melancholic, and creates an atmosphere of memory, almost dreamlike. In the main pictures, it becomes increasingly moving and impressive. These variations of light contribute to the narrative.
What do you think? What current challenges are reflected in these images?
When they were created, they represented the present and the recent past. Today, they have become historical documents in their own right and bear witness not only to the world they depict, but also to the way that time saw and perceived itself. And finally, the transition of the Polus from a factory into a multifunctional center has given these images a new meaning.
What could we learn from Basilico's work today?
These works speak to enduring themes: the tension between tradition and innovation, the value of labor, and the search for one's own distinctive way of being. Polus now organizes economic, entrepreneurial, cultural, and artistic activities in the Sala Basilico, and shows how industrial spaces can reinvent themselves, keeping the past alive and promoting dialogue between generations. Basilico's works form a bridge between this reorientation and the historical memory of the place.
We are also interested in how Polus can make the most of this legacy.
Understanding the historical moment associated with these works and their messages are the essential elements to open and stimulate a dialogue. It is important that new generations are also confronted with these images, not as relics of the past, but as a stimulus to reflect on the present and the future of the territory.
Basilico's cycle is more than a historical snapshot. It's a challenge to see identity as evolving, not fixed. The Sala Basilico invites us to reflect. How do we honor heritage while embracing change?
Exactly. These paintings remind us that progress needn't erase the past. Visiting today, we're part of that dialogue. Just as Ticino now navigates globalization, Basilico's work asks, what will we carry forward?
How might Basilico depict today's Ticino with globalization and digital transformation?
These works are a legacy that speaks not only of art, but also of one's own roots, social evolution, and collective memory. Visiting them means immersing yourself in a history that is still relevant, in a dialogue between past and present that ultimately helps us to become more aware. Just like back then, regions like Ticino are now faced with the question, how do you preserve one's way of being in a globalized world? Basilico's work invites us to reflect on the sustainability of transformation.
Basilico's cycle is more than a contemporary document. It is an appeal to understand identity not as a counterpart, but as the result of change. The Sala Carlo Basilico thus remains a place of reflection and inspiration, an example of how art can interpret and accompany social evolution.